Hello. In this video, you will learn how to do a one-way Ancova in R. First, let's talk about what an Ancova is. In a video before, you learned about one-way ANOVAs. A one-way ANOVA is used to investigate differences among sometimes two, three, or more groups of individuals that vary on a dependent variable. However, there are other independent variables that affect the research result. Researchers have to take other variables into account at the data analysis stage. An independent variable that interferes with the influence of the target independent variable on the dependent variable is known as an intervening or moderating variable. The one-way analysis of covariance, or Ancova, is a statistical method that researchers employ to minimize the effect of a known intervening variable on a dependent variable. The intervening or moderating variable that gets entered into the Ancova is known as a covariate. So I will be saying covariate today, and you can just think of the covariate as the intervening or moderating variable that we are trying to control for. As usual, the first step in our analysis today is going to be to talk a little bit about our data. And before we do that, I want to give credit to this blog. It's a website online that you can visit, and it's got a good explanation of all the code that we'll go over now with a different example in their case. But I use a lot of their code, and I think on the blog, the person who wrote it mentions that they use a lot of the code from Discovering Statistics Using R by Andy Field. So check that book out as well. Both of those are great resources. The data for today is similar to what we've worked with before, except in a new context. Group 1, or Class 1, can be thought of as attending an on-site ESL class. Group 2 is attending an online ESL class. Group 3 is attending a hybrid, both on-site and online ESL classes. For each learner, there are two sets of measures of motivation. Motivation meaning how much inherent desire there is for learning. One pre-program measure of motivation before they attended the courses, and one post-program measure of motivation after they went to the classes. So all three groups took two measures of motivation, one before they took the classes and one after. Now we want to compare the motivation level of the three groups at the end of the courses. So we just want to look at the post-program motivation. However, after making adjustments for their motivation level before they started the courses. So in this case, we think pre-motivation levels might affect post-motivation levels. In other words, we want to control for the effect of already existing differences in the motivation level of learners while comparing their motivation levels at the end of the courses. In this case, pre-program motivation is the covariate and post-program motivation is the dependent variable. And our independent variable are the three different types of classes. First up, we want to import our data. So go to wherever your data is and select data for Ancova and R. We can take a look at that data. As you can see, the data has three columns or vectors. One of them is a group variable, which has 1, 2, or 3 for group 1, 2, or 3, class 1, 2, or 3, the pre-program motivation score, and the post-program motivation score. We want to first convert group to a factor to be able to use it later. So we'll use this factor function and rename those class 1, 2, and 3. So now we can see the group is a factor, class 1, 2, and 3. And instead of just 1, 2, and 3, now it'll say class 3, class 2. Okay. As we go on, if you don't have one of these packages downloaded, please just download the package. You want to load the package and then run the following code. And what this code is showing us is that for our post motivation variable, the mean for each group is 6.05 for class 1. For class 2, it's 5.83. And for class 3, it's 5.311. And here we can see that each group has 15 participants in it. So what we're looking at here is the raw data that's coming from the data that we imported. So these means are just the overall mean or average of the post class motivation measure. We haven't yet changed anything to account for our covariate, which is in this case pre-motivation level. We'll do that later though. Next up, we're just going to run some code in order to look at some visualizations. So we're going to restructure that code real quick, and we won't really use this later, but we'll just use it for this intermediate step. Here you can see it got restructured like so. And then we'll rename some columns. Load ggplot, which is a visualization package. And we'll take a look at some box plots just to visualize our data further. Here we can see on the left, we have 3 box plots that represent our 3 classes, and this is for pre-program motivation. On our vertical or y-axis, we can see motivation level. So here, what we're really interested in is post-program motivation, after the students, the language learners, have taken their respective classes. However, we want to somehow take into account, or we want to control for their pre-program motivation. So here we just see the raw pre-program motivation and the raw post-program motivation. And when I say raw, I just mean we gave the learners a measure, and these represent those measures. Here we can see that the class 3 has a lower motivation than class 2. Class 2 has a large range, and class 1 has the highest overall with a smaller range, so the mean would be higher. We're going to proceed now, keep going. We're going to load another library and then look at Levine's test for homogeneity of variances. And we can see that the statistic is not significant, which means we can assume that we do have homogeneity of variances for our different groups. So that's good. We'll run some more code and take a look at that. And here again, we can see that this statistic is not significant, which means that the covariate and the independent variable are independent. This is what we want. Next up, with the one-way Ancova are a bunch of assumptions. And I won't read over the assumptions now, but you can read over them. And throughout the course of the video, you'll see us mention different things here as we're going through these different assumptions. So you want to make sure if you don't know what something means that I say, double check maybe it's an assumption, and then you can go and do some extra research to learn more about that assumption in order to learn why we're trying to guard against it in order to use the different models for the Ancova. All right, next up we're going to run our Ancova. Specifically, we do what's called orthogonal contrasts, which is a fancy word, but we're not going to go too much into it for now. So I'm going to run this code. And in our output, we can look at the group line, and we can see that for our group, we do have a significant amount of difference. We just don't know which two groups it's between. So if you remember, just like for the ANOVA, first we run our ANOVA, and if it's significant, then we go and run some post hoc tests to see where the significance is between which groups. So we did something similar just now with this code, except that we've included our covariate, which is pre-program motivation. So we've included the covariate. Here's our dependent variable that we're interested in, post-program motivation, and here's our independent variable. And because this is significant, we know that our model is finding what we want it to find, or what we might expect it to find. We might assume that there is going to be a difference, and this is telling us that there is a difference. We just don't know where it is yet. Now we're going to look at whether or not our data are normally distributed, and this goes back to some of the assumptions. And whenever we're looking at normal distribution, we need to look at the standardized residuals. We're not looking at the regular data that we brought in. We have to look at something called standardized residuals. And when we run that code, we get a column or a vector that are those residuals. And then in the following code, I attach that vector to our overall data set. So I just put the standardized residuals vector onto the bigger data frame. So now it's part of the data frame, and it matches along each row with the numbers it should match with. And then with this code, I want to break out our data into 3 subsets. So you can see what I just did is with C1 subset, this means class 1 subset. I've taken out class 1, made a new variable, and saved just class 1's data to this variable so we can use it later. And I did the same thing for class 2 and class 3. Keep in mind that I have not altered the original data, so if I run this code, you can see it looks the exact same as it did before. This is good practice to not alter original variables and maybe make new variables as you continue working so you're not overwriting what you've already done. Now I take each of these subset groups and specifically look at the standardized residual column in order to see if the standardized residuals are significant or not in terms of the Shapiro test. So I run those, and we can see that none of these values are significant, which means that we can assume that they're approximately normally distributed. Next up, we have the assumption of homoscedasticity. We want homoscedasticity in this case, and we're going to run some code to see if we can get it. Just like before we looked at the standardized residuals, we're also going to look at some standardized residuals here. the same standardized residuals, and we're going to look at something called predicted values too. So we're not looking at the regular data here. We're looking at something called standardized residuals and something called predicted values. After I run this code and I attach the predicted values to the data frame that we were working with before, you can see that I've added both the standardized residuals and the predicted values. And then I make some subsets like I did with the last example. So these subsets look similar to the ones I made before, except they have this extra predicted values column. And then I make some scatter plots. And a scatter plot is just a plot with a bunch of points on it, and each point represents a data point. And they can give you a sense of how your data is distributed and what it looks like in comparison between two variables. And here, our x variable are our predicted values, and our y variable are our standardized residuals. Before I show you what the scatter plots look like, I want to show you what we're looking for. So here we're checking for homoscedasticity. We want homoscedasticity. Homoscedasticity, in contrast to these, homoscedasticity just means that our data are sort of randomly distributed. So here you see different shapes. We don't want to see these shapes in our outputs. What we want are dots just to be sort of everywhere without any kind of pattern. But here you see three different kinds of patterns that can be troublesome and might mean that you need to do a different kind of test other than a regular Ancova. So if we see one of these shapes, it's cause for concern and reason to maybe change what kind of test we're doing. And if we don't have homoscedasticity, we can also consider transformations of the data through a log transformation or a square transformation. Okay. Now, with that in mind, we're going to run through our plots. So this is the first one. So this is for class 1. So we can see that the dots are sort of spread out pretty evenly, and it doesn't look like any of those shapes are happening. So that one looks okay. Here's for class 2. Again, we can sort of see that the dots are spread out. It doesn't look like we see one of those shapes. And the same thing for the third one. Here that might be the start of a shape, since this part of the graphic is not consumed or doesn't have any points in it, but in general they're pretty spread out. The dots are pretty spread out. So we can say that we assume that we do have homoscedasticity in the case of our data. And something interesting to think about is that what we're doing whenever we use a covariate is we're sort of adjusting our means for the covariate. So we're not actually looking at those original means necessarily that we brought in. And when I say the original means, I mean so per class, so say class 1, and then if you look at the dependent variable just for class 1, and the dependent variable is post-program motivation. So if you just look at post-program motivation and take the mean for class 1, what we're looking at is just the raw mean of what we brought in, but what we're really interested in is how the covariate would affect that mean. So we would need to adjust those means a little bit to account for the covariate. So we'll do that now, and we use this code to do it. And here in this first row, we can see that our adjusted means are like so. There's 6, 5.8, and 5.4. And if we go back up to some previous code, and run our first example here. Here we can see that before, for class 1, our mean was 6.05, and now it's 6.0, the adjusted mean for the covariate. So they're very similar. For class 2, before we were 5.83, now we're at 5.8, so that one's also pretty similar. For class 3, before we were at 5.3, and now we're at 5.4. So we can see that the adjusted mean has gone up now to account for the covariate. And the reason we look at all of this stuff is that if you were writing a real research paper, these are some of the things that you would include in that research paper. We're going to go back down to where we were. And we also had the standard errors there if you want to use the standard errors. And if you're interested, we can also look at what our ANOVA would have been without the covariate having been accounted for. And here we can see that we would have had a significant difference even if we didn't account for the covariate. However, whenever we look at our covariate, whenever we look at our Ancova versus the ANOVA for the group, we can see that for the group, our p-value is more statistically significant. It has a higher significance than we would have with just the ANOVA here. So we can see that what we're doing is changing things for the better in terms of our analysis. We're controlling for something that we should potentially be controlling for, and that is the pre-program motivation level of our learners. Okay, so we just looked at the ANOVA when the covariate is not accounted for. And now we're going to look at those post hoc tests. So remember, we know that our Ancova model is significant, but we just don't know where that significance is. It could be between class 1 and class 2, class 1 and class 3, or some combination. We just don't know. And this is how we find out. So we run this code. And this output gives us a nice contrast between each of our groups. And here we can see that all of our p-values are significant. So in this case, each respective class, class 1, class 2, and class 3, are statistically significantly different from each other. And we also printed out the confidence intervals for those values if you wanted to include that in something you were writing. Here's also some code for some additional visualizations. We won't go too much into these additional visualizations, but this one in particular can also be used to look at homoscedasticity. This one can be used when you're thinking about whether your data are normally distributed. And here are some other ones. Okay. Another assumption that we haven't talked about yet is called homogeneity of regression slopes. And this is the code that you would use in order to think about homogeneity of regression slopes. Basically, what we're interested in whenever we produce a chart like this, and when we're talking about these regression slopes, we want to try to make sure that these lines, in simple terms, are lining up with each other. So we want to try to see if they're parallel. Here we can see that all three lines which represent each of our three classes, the blue one is class 3, the green one is class 2, and the red one is class 1, we can see that they look similar to each other. So we can say that we have met the assumption of homogeneity of regression slopes in this case. Now, if one of the lines looked like this, if it was coming across like this, we would have maybe a problem. And if the relationships are not linear and you violated this assumption, the Ancova, it isn't a suitable analysis. However, if it makes sense for your data, you might be able to coax your data to have a linear relationship by transforming the covariate and still be able to run an Ancova. If you have a nonlinear relationship, you can consider transformations of either the covariate or dependent variable or both. If you have a relationship where the dependent variable starts to increase more rapidly with increasing covariate variable values, you can first consider a log transformation. If your data does the opposite, the dependent variable values decrease more rapidly with increasing covariate variable values, you can first consider a square transformation. A square transformation is simply squaring the dependent variable. But in our case, we can see that our three lines are looking similar, so we're okay. All right. Next up, we have some more data to double check that our homogeneity regression slopes is working how we want it to work. And specifically from this output, we would be interested in this value here, and it's not significant, so we're in good shape there. And there we're looking at our covariate by group, and it's not significant, so that's good. And lastly, we might be interested in, and I'm not going to run the install because I've already installed it. If we're interested in the effect size, we can look at that output. And you would be interested in this effect size value here, which is the partial eta square for the group. And we can see that the effect size here is quite large. That about does it for all the code that we'll go over today. And as usual, I've put all of our output down here, just in case you want to look at it again afterward. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.